Hi, everyone. We have a very intimate group, I think, tonight. But so we have two presenters in this session. The first, who is sharing her screen now, is Karin Frey. And you can see the title, What Do Honor and Face Norms Have to Do with Peer Relations? Adolescents Make Sense of Revenge. So you have 10 minutes to present, and then some time. That includes time for questions too, but again, we're only two presenters, so we're a little more flexible at that time. And then we'll have our second presenter, Luke, same thing with questions afterwards, and then some time for discussion at the end. So go ahead, Karin, take it away.
Making sense of revenge. What do honor and face norms have to do with peer relations? For that matter, what do historical colonization patterns have to do with norms and revenge in the United States? And, okay. So sociocultural norms enable people to coordinate their actions by creating shared expectations of routines and how to manage conflicts. Because norms are linked to social and physical ecological conditions, they probably originated in specific locales. Despite this, most of us are familiar with multiple normative systems, and each one can be elicited by relevant cues. You may not be a particularly vengeful person, for example, but given a tale of injustice, you might celebrate a movie hero's vengeful action. So, norms are examples of situated cognition, which raises the question, where have they been situated? Honor norms are a strategy of family protection when you can't rely on state institutions for protection and justice. Traditionally, pastoralist societies are examples of honor societies. Your family wealth is highly portable and your family is isolated. You can't call for help. Wars offer no protection for families as well. Aristocracy is just a fancy word for clan. Like other clans, people, kings, dictators form alliances for self-protection. Families are also left without protection when authority figures, the state, is abusive. You can't trust calling 911. So the logical thing to do in all of these cases is to form alliances and act tough. Even a small insult may be an adversary's way of testing to see if you'll defend your family. So you always have to watch for threats and you have to attack. This is a warrior strategy. This definition of honor is part of training for Marines and many police forces. Where have face norms been situated? Often where crops are labor intensive and demand a lot of cooperation. So rice cultivation, not wheat. Another characteristic is small land holdings and densely packed populations. There's no room for jerks, and you need to cooperate to put food on the table. So in these conditions, social harmony and humility are prized. Hierarchy and tradition also help reduce conflicts because norms are very clear and they're enforced. The understanding is that you get protection by being dutiful to your social superiors who are supposed to provide for your security. You may be wondering why this is important for schools today. In the United States, regions that subscribe to honor norms enable corporal punishment. 15 states, the last I counted. They have the highest numbers of student-perpetrated school shootings. This reflects adult patterns of murder after insults. Adolescent males also have higher injury rates from risky action. Displaying manhood by being a bit of a daredevil is an important honor value. So if we look at the historical colonization patterns, there are three major waves of Europeans from honor cultures. English aristocrats migrated to the southern colonies. These were descendants of the Normans who conquered England in 1066 and instituted quite a brutal occupation. So the brutality of slavery was not something new for these people. Spanish conquistadors, the name gives it away, brought Spanish honor culture to the Southwest in California. Like other southern colonies, this was essentially a feudal society which enslaved Aboriginals instead of Africans. And finally, the Scots-Irish, who had endured 600 years of warfare and roving bands of marauders, brought the clan structure to Appalachians. After the Civil War, a lot of Southerners moved to the western frontier. Today, the politically red areas of the United States tend to be honor strongholds. New England had a different history. Entire English villages arrived together, bringing a police force, judges. So people expected the state, as it were, to provide protection. This was a 911 culture. Some New Englanders migrated to the northern Midwest and the northern Pacific coast. The blue areas on the map have a tradition of dignity culture. I won't actually be talking about dignity culture today because those items on our survey weren't really strong psychometrically. But I will mention Chinese and others, possibly West Africans from rice growing regions, established thriving enclaves of face culture. As far as Aboriginal people go, we don't really know. My guess is there's a lot of variation. The mound builders of the Mississippi Valley have characteristics of face societies. Northern Plains tribes, very tough environment. They prize things like counting coup, which sounds very much like a male honor behavior. So Shelley Email, Ada Onyewenye, and I constructed a survey. Here are some example items. You lose respect if you back down from a fight. I do not allow anyone to insult my family and friends. To be successful, you must have loyal allies. Favors must always be repaid, even if it's not really safe to do so. And our face items. I'm extremely careful not to embarrass others. I listen carefully if others criticize me. It's important that you do your duty with humility, and I try to adjust myself to other people's expectations. So along with this survey, we interviewed teenagers about their actions after they and peers were harassed, bullied, or discriminated against. We expected no ethnic differences in actions or how teens evaluated themselves, and we didn't find any. In general, teens all agreed that they felt proud. They felt like they'd been good friends after calming and keeping friends out of trouble. This phrase, keeping friends out of trouble, really meant a lot to them. They felt guilty when they harmed someone else. And after avenging a friend, they felt both guilty and a little proud that they'd been good allies. Again, there were no ethnic differences in norm endorsement, but within each group, we found individual differences. We divided participants at the midpoint into strong and weak endorsement, and we got roughly equal groups of honor and face norm endorsers. There was no overlap between them. So we looked at two types of vengeful acts: revenge enacted on your own behalf and revenge enacted on another's behalf, that is, third-party revenge. And here you can see that high honor endorsers, those in red, felt proud when they were angry, especially when they were avenging a friend on the right. According to honor norms, they were being really good allies, scaring off friends' threats to themselves and those they care about. Interestingly, honor endorsers also felt guilt when avenging a friend, which they didn't feel when avenging themselves. We found that thinking about third-party revenge elicited the most morally complex and nuanced thinking of all of our conditions. Now, in contrast, the high face endorsers in aqua felt both shame and guilt when they avenged especially avenging themselves. This is neither a humble nor a harmonious behavior. When teens rated their emotions and whether they felt like they were good friends, they explained why they were proud, sad, etc. For this study, we used a priori codes based on Ryan and Dietschy's basic needs theory and Schwartz's value circumplex model, which has been used with over 40,000 people in 56 countries. That was good enough for us. So along with the goals cited in the explanations, we coded whether the action promoted or threatened those goals. If we look at benevolence, we can see that third-party revenge could promote benevolence, as in they don't mess with her anymore, and it could also threaten it. I realized I was doing to them exactly what they had done to my friend. Security, not surprisingly, was a common goal. We found goals related to physical security. I didn't have to worry about a fight, or I was scared he would come back, but also relational security. After being successful, a person might say, now we're much closer. However, they sometimes said it might break up our friendship. This is when friends disagreed on what the proper course of action was. Power is important in revenge. He got scared and understood me. He can't get too comfortable with me. Power is a risky thing, doesn't always work. I lost, so fighting did no good. Another important element in these explanations was self-direction or authenticity. I didn't feel like I had to agree with my friend. I was able to keep thinking for myself versus your emotions just take you over at that moment and it's wrong. So looking at personal revenge on the left, honor endorsers felt they'd promoted their own power and security, but you can see that their actions also threaten those goals. These high-risk actions, sometimes you fail, but for honor, you have to act, even if things don't look that good for success. Despite pride of honor, teens often experience threats to self-direction, which was expressed as, this wasn't me, this isn't me. They're saying, I'm not this person who had harmed others. And that sentiment, not surprisingly, was especially heightened for face endorsers. For them, revenge was primarily a threat to security, to benevolence, to self-identity. You can see the major differences in the subtractive model for personal revenge. Stepping back, though, I want to mention that the lack of benevolence promotion is really important because acting to help others seems to strengthen teens' identities. In other work with Brendan, we found that benevolence was the nexus of identity-related thinking. Here we see nothing to build an identity around. Kids are saying this action isn't me, but there's no hint of what is me. So we come back to this question of why is this important for schools besides the implications for self-identity? The fact is, North America was a culturally diverse area before colonization, and it remains so today. It helps to have shared expectations. It reduces conflict and enables resolution. But the most important thought I want to leave you with is true of schools as well as societies at large. People use retaliation to obtain justice. While honor norms are a logical response to a harsh environment and institutional failures, they're an inadequate substitute for a system that protects and provides justice to all. So, Do you want to, oh, wait a second, where's my, sorry, I'm having trouble not sharing. What were you saying about sharing power, Brandon?
Here, if you would like, I can stop sharing your screen, Karen.
Thank you.
And depending on the question, we might have to pull up your slides again, potentially. So I'll open it up. I like to do questions right after the presentation. We have the luxury of having two presenters. So we have, even though we're a little bit over, we can still, I think, do this. I feel like when you ask questions after two presentations, the questions are always about the second presentation, not the first. So, and I'll open it up for any questions from the few of us who are here. I'll wait a little bit longer. Otherwise, I have some myself. Brendan, do you have something?
Yeah, I do, but I also wanted to give people a chance to jump in. But I'm interested in this partially because of the work that you and I have done before, and how you spoke to that a little bit in terms of how they relate to it. But I also have different exposures to some of these cultures personally. Some that I brought up in, others that I've spent a lot of time in, and so I think I'd be kind of curious to hear about your thoughts about how particularly this is important. You started touching on this in terms of the identity formation, but in adolescence, when people are developing their identity, how important this is. And I think I liked how you've kind of framed this historically and in different places in terms of like, okay, if you didn't have a system, if you're not a 911 culture, like this is a natural response to certain threats. And I think in different parts of the United States and throughout the rest of the world, there aren't necessarily places where you can rely on the states. But I think your focus on justice was an important one. So I thought there's a few levels there. Like if you could talk about maybe how you see the relationship between adolescent development and then maybe what that means for, justice more broadly in our society. I'd be really interested to hear you talk about that.
Well, part of adolescent identity development is situating yourself within the group. And we have a natural tendency to sort of focus on or very often on demographics because those are visible. But when kids talk about the aspects of their identity that are really important to them, what you might call moral identity is very important. And for adolescents, it's often expressed in this term of being a good friend. This was something prior to actually collecting data. I spent 2 years in various communities doing interviews, and I kept hearing this, being a good friend. And that really seems to have a lot of meaning. And kids are not always good friends. Sometimes they incite their friends to take revenge. Sometimes they're bored and they want to see a fight. And they do beat themselves up over that. And which is a very interesting thing because their friends don't get to see that. They get to see the bravado. And this is also true for their teachers. Their teachers don't get to see these very nuanced and kind of remorseful ways of thinking about their peer interactions. This is kind of that invisible part of it. And so kids are looking for those commonalities with their peers, but very often it's based on kind of a false narrative of what their peers value. We know that they overestimate how much their peers value revenge, and they underestimate how much their peers value peaceful resolutions to things. Their peers are essentially saying the same things they are, but no one feels really comfortable revealing that because if they do, they might be vulnerable. I'm sort of going off away from your question a little bit, so you can reel me back in.
No, I thought that was good. I mean, I was curious about how then, in terms of the moral development, and I think the kind of the systems that are in place or these cultural practices, how that can lead to or not lead to justice systems for people. I think like that was kind of an interesting point to me. If you have this honor system where you're, you know, the way that you kind of protect yourself or deal with certain types of threats, it precludes, it's a might is right kind of thing, right? There's no guarantee that.
Yes. Well, and you have personal responsibility for gaining justice. An interesting question, and I don't know the answer to this, is whether institutional justice is less satisfying if you're from an honor culture. But we certainly know that that without institutional justice, you're going to get honor cultures. I mean, it doesn't matter if you belong to a group who, could we think of any groups that are treated poorly by the police? Well, in those circumstances, you're gonna stop and think before you call for the police. If you belong to any kind of oppressed group, or even if you belong to a criminal group, if you're a criminal, you can't call the police. You have to take matters into your own hands. And so we see that in school grounds. Teenagers do not think that that school authorities are effective at all against bullying. And so we have very high levels of revenge. And in fact, kids actually will use the idea of retaliation as justification for bullying. I mean, we see that even in second grade. He did it first. So this is a way of enabling me, because revenge is a more acceptable kind of aggression than, say, bullying. It's a way to bolster your identity, even though you're doing harm to someone. But what we see is that harm doing still comes at a cost. Cinnamon.
Yeah, in different situations, you're going to hear different types of discourse and different types of emphasis on whether or not you value honor or face. You can be in school, and the school can be encouraging more of an honor retaliation type situation. You could go home and they could encourage something different. You listen to your community or the police or the political system, they're going to say something. You belong to a sports team and they're going to tell you something else. You know, you protect your team. What do you think about the interaction between these places and how individuals form their identity based on conflicting discourses and conflicting information they're getting from these different groups?
That's a fascinating question. And I can't say that we can even begin to address that there, but we do know that, and this comes back to this idea of situated cognition, because the regional differences I've talked about, these are nothing more than a bunch of cues, and environmental cues that are there stimulating you to think in line with the dominant regional narrative more than others. But on your day-to-day basis, it's going to change all the time. And it's very clear. I mean, even social psychologists are able to elicit this with the most minimal of things. But I think what then becomes often reified is the connection to religious training and ideology. because that sense of authenticity and the idea that the most authentic part of me is morally good takes different, it's interpreted differently according to ideology and according to religion. So I think those elements of the environment that start to speak to that moral or ideological core are ones that probably have the most impact on that. Do you have ideas about that, Cinnamon?
No, I think it's just such a conflicting thing, and I think that contributes to identity development so much. You know, individuals are told one thing from their home and their church and so forth, and they start building this, but then they see something different when they go out into the authentic world that they're having to deal with. And how they manage this and decide what they can show in one place. I'm just interested if there's any studies like, what do I show in this place versus what I show at home? What I show my brother who takes my toy versus I'm at school and my best friend's being bullied. And if individuals are actually navigating those differences in their head and understanding that they're doing it, and it's not just benevolence or moral understanding, is this is what I can do in this situation, and this is who I am in this situation.
Yeah, yeah, nice.
So I have what's probably a much more mundane question, I guess, but I'm looking, I mean, I'm thinking especially about that second set of results with the, was 8 codes or 9 codes or whatever. I mean, that seems like a really striking difference that aligns really well with the underlying theory of, you know, of different forms of cultures. How is this, not the ideas so much, but like, how is this way of exploring these ideas and validating them and testing them and so on, how is that being taken up in your community of scholarship, you know, in the developmental world? Are people go, oh wow, or they go, or no?
Well, my colleagues, I have some new colleagues to work on this with, but we're kind of outliers right now. I wouldn't say it has been rejected, but because it's really new. When I give talks, I inevitably have people come up to me and go, oh, you've helped me make sense of something that made no sense to me at all. You know, teachers, you know, African-American teachers that moved from New England to Georgia and thought that they would have so much in common with their students. It was like we were from different planets. So I would say that we haven't made enough of an impact to know if people are rejecting this or not. One of the things that I'm interested in looking at this is how this affects decision-making of educators. You would predict, and we've got a little online study looking at this now, especially if there's any kind of defiance on this part of the student, that that would really elicit a high level of punishment for someone who is, well, whose dominant perspective is honor, or if they belong to like a military academy that focuses on honor. And I think that's a pretty interesting area for me. One of my colleagues, well, I have 2 colleagues from Alabama, so we're going to be at opposite ends of the spectrum. For me, doing these studies in Seattle, I'm highly aware that people are going to look at the punishment options and go, oh, this is grotesque. And my Alabama colleagues go, these are pretty wimpy. So I don't know the answer yet. What do you think about it, David?
Well, I think actually I don't really know the answer to the question that you answered. I was asking a question about sort of uptake within the academic community for these representations in this way of analyzing the data. And I don't know the answer to that one either. So
Right, yeah. Well, I don't have an answer yet for the first one.
Thank you, Karin. Thank you for sharing your work. Yes, applause and virtual applause. We're a small group, so if you want to unmute your mic and give her some real applause. Thank you. We always learn a lot from you. I do, especially because it's not my area. So thank you for sharing. Okay, next we have Luc Paquette, who is sharing his work and his colleagues' work on using epistemic networks to analyze self-regulated learning in an open-ended problem-solving environment. You're sharing your screen already. Thank you. All right, take it away, Luc.
All right, thank you. Just before we get started, I do want to say earlier in the call, I had some issue with connectivity. And so if for some reason I start freezing up or something, please let me know and I'll try to figure out how to fix it, especially because I have a tendency to talk fast. So, maybe I'm going to be like 3 slides later by the time I unfreeze. And so thank you for the introduction. Like Gal said, I will be presenting some work we've been doing on epistemic network analysis for self-regulated learning and open-ended learning environment. This is work I've been doing with colleagues at both the University of Pennsylvania and Vanderbilt University. I'm going to give some very brief context, given that it's a 10-minute talk, so I'm going to go pretty fast. But this is kind of situated in the perspective of the importance of self-regulated learning, or SRL, for students as they engage with open-ended problem-solving environments, and also in terms of as they're using digital learning environment, they're producing very rich and detailed traces of their actions within that environment, and that allows us to do a little bit more micro-level analysis of how they experience the environment and how they experience learning. And more specifically, this work is in the context of a learning environment called Betty's Brain. And so what we did is we investigated from the perspective of 3 different categories of open-ended problem-solving actions that are first information seeking, then we have solution construction, and finally solution assessment. And then we use epistemic network analysis to visualize and study the co-occurrence of behaviors within each of those categories and also across those categories. And so if you're not familiar with Betty's Brain, a very short introduction. Betty's Brain is a learning environment that's called a learning by teaching environment, where the student has to build a concept map to teach a virtual agent called Betty about a scientific phenomenon. In this case, it's climate change. And so the way they engage with the learning environment is that they'll read hypertext resources about that phenomenon. Then they'll take the information from the resource, they'll try to build a concept map. Then based on that, they can have Betty take a quiz, and then she'll answer questions based on the content of the map. And then based on what she gets right, what she gets wrong, then the student has to kind of figure out, okay, going back to the resources, figuring out what is wrong in the concept map, and then iteratively improving their model. And so in Betty's Brain, there's a lot of different kind of actions that the students can be doing within the learning environment. So what we did is we took all of those key actions and then we aligned them with the 3 categories of problem solving, open-ended problem solving actions. So this is what it looks like, at least the way we categorize them. And so, for example, the component of problem solving that's related to information seeking aligns with actions related to reading resources within the learning environment. Actions related to solution construction are related to adding, deleting concept in the map, adding or revising links in the map. And then finally, solution assessment is when they ask Betty a question or when they ask Betty to take a quiz and when they look at the answer and the results of those quizzes. And so this is kind of the general framing of how we try to align the actions with the 3 categories of open-ended learning, problem solving. But then each one of those actions can also be further specified in some ways, at least most of them. And so, for example, the reading actions, even though there's only one type of action that's information seeking, that's reading, we can look at it from different perspectives. There's their first new reading, the first time they look at a resource. And so this is important because it exposes them to new information that they haven't seen before. For readings, we also make the distinction between the reading that's considered long or short. And the idea behind that is that something that is too short, especially because they're long reading, means that they really didn't take the time to look at the information and they didn't really acquire the information that was in the reading. And that can be more indicative of a student that's just kind of going through different resources until they find something that they actually want to read. And so we want to make the distinction between those two types of reading actions. We have a similar classification for viewing quiz results, right? If they're too short, then it's really more indicative of a student just kind of clicking through the quiz result than actually spending time to look at the result and try to analyze it. So we want to make the distinction between those two. And then finally, another notion that's very important in this context is the notion of coherence of actions. So actions are considered as coherent if they're informed by past action that the student has been doing, right? So here I have an example to kind of make this concept a little bit more concrete, but it's related to, let's say the student reads an hyperlinked resource. In that resource, there's information about different concepts and how they relate to each other. And then the student goes into the concept map and then adds a link between those two concepts, right? So then we'll say that this action of adding a link is coherent with the reading that the student just made because it's informed by the reading the student made. Now, the other side of things is if the student just goes directly in the map and adds a link between two concepts without actually reading a resource that talks about those concepts prior to adding the link. And that can happen in different situations. It can happen if the student is just guessing. It can also happen if the student is trying to use their own personal knowledge of the phenomenon to fill the map without looking at the hypertext resources. Another thing that's important to consider is that coherence is not the same thing as correct, right? So an action can be coherent because it's informed by past reading, but incorrect because they didn't understand the reading. And an action can be incoherent because it comes, let's say, from their prior knowledge, but still correct because they have good prior knowledge. And so here the notion of coherence is important in the context of self-regulated learning because we want to see if the students are kind of going through the process of setting a goal, getting the information, and then trying to apply the information, evaluating it, and then kind of engaging in that loop. And so in terms of coherence, there's 3 types of actions that can be coherent or incoherent. So adding a link, editing a link, and then readings, and this is only for long readings, can be either informed by, let's say, the looking at the quiz results or not, so coherent or incoherent. And so here what I tried to do is kind of give a little bit of an example of a typical expected behavior if the students were to engage in this cycle of the 3 categories of problem solving actions that we have here. This is a very simplified example because I'm excluding a lot of types of actions just to kind of make it visible. We can actually look at it and understand it. So what you might expect is the student are going to start by engaging in some kind of information seeking. So that might include doing some short readings until they find something that they do want to read. Hopefully this is coherent with what they've been doing in the past. Then once they've done that reading, they might move on to the map and then either add or edit a link in the map based on those readings. Again, we're hoping this is going to be coherent. Once they've edited the map, they might go back to information seeking to kind of continue building the map. And then once they've reached a certain point, you would expect them to go and have Betty take a quiz to evaluate, assess their solution. And then based on that, you would expect them to look at the results. And then from those results, informing what they should be reading next in terms of improving their map, right? So this is just kind of a very simplified example of what we might expect as being the typical behavior. And so what we wanted to do then is kind of use epistemic network analysis to see if we can find patterns that are similar to that in the actions that are collected from students using the learning environment. And so this study took place with 98 6th graders that used that participated for 7 days. So we started with a pre-test and then a post-test at the end. And then in the middle, they first add some training on how to use Betty's Brain, and then they use Betty's Brain for 4 days to try to build a concept map related to climate change. I'm not going to go into the details of the numbers for the test, but then what we did is we took the students and we separated it into 2 groups, high performers in the task and low performer, using a median split on the learning gains. So what we wanted to do then is generate those epistemic networks and compare those across the low and high performing student to see if we could distinguish between patterns of behaviors across the 2 groups of students. And so we generated a network based on those 3 categories that we identified at the beginning. And what we did is we generated those network using subset of categories and kind of building up from like one category, only information seeking, and then combining 2 categories to look at the connections between the different part of the problem solving process, and then finally looking at the 3 categories together. I'm not going to look at all the networks with the group here today, because we actually had a lot of networks, but I'm going to kind of highlight just a few just to give example of what we saw from the network. And so this is the network that is only for information seeking. It's actually the simplest network that we have, I think. And here, and it's going to be the same pattern for each one. High performers are identified in red, and they're usually on the right side of the graph, and then low performer are blue. And so for information seeking, what we see first is that short reading are the most central to the graph, and that's not really surprising. Really, that's one of the most common action in the learning environment is short reading, mostly because they might click a lot of resource before they decide to read one. For high performer, we can see that short reading are more strongly connected with the coherent reading, which is in line with what we were expecting, compared to the low performer, where the short reading were more strongly connected to incoherent reading. So far, kind of aligned with what we were expecting. When we look at solution construction, for the high performer, I'd say this is still mostly aligned with what we were expecting, in that the networks become a little bit more difficult to read as we add more actions. But at the top here, we have the coherent addition of links, and then we have the coherent revisions of link. And what we can see is that there's more connections between actions that are coherent for high performer, which again is in line with what we would be expecting. One thing that was maybe a little bit more surprising is that there is not really a lot of differences in the connection for the incoherent action. So it seems like both group actually engage in those incoherent actions in pretty similar way, but one distinction is how the high performer engaged with the coherent actions. Another thing that was surprising to me is for the low performer, you can see there's a pretty strong link with adding and deleting a concept. And this to me raised questions about how the low performer used Betty's Brain. To give some context, in Betty's Brain, adding a concept in the map is not something that is a challenging action. You just click a button, you say, I want to add a concept, and then you're provided with a drop-down menu of all the concepts you could be adding. And then once the concept is added to the map, there's really no good reason to remove it. Because you can't really make a mistake in which concept you include in the map. At some point, probably all the concepts are going to be in the map. It's just when you want to add them as you're building the map. So kind of this connection between adding and deleting concepts, it seems like there's something happening there in terms of the low performer, how they engage with Betty's Brain. I can't really say what is happening. This is kind of an open question for me. I would like to go further and investigate and maybe kind of observe what's going on. It's not something that's really easy to see just from the log data itself, by itself. And then I also have some examples of networks that connect two different categories of action. So this is for information seeking and solution construction. And here, when we were combining 2 categories together, we were mostly interested in looking at the connections between the categories. So for example, here at the bottom in the middle, we have the short reading. And then if you go up right, you have the coherent readings. So we were interested in how those connect with the solution construction actions. And what we can see is a very similar pattern. It's very similar pattern kind of happened in a lot of the graphs that we were looking at. For the high performer, there are stronger connections that relate to actions from the expected cycle that I showed earlier with the coherent action. For the incoherent action, there's really not much difference between the two groups. And then for the low performer, there's always this connection here, for example, between short reading and deleting concept, and then short reading and adding concept, right? Which is, again, something that was unexpected when I was looking at the data, when I was first generating the networks. And then here we have the network that connects both solution construction and solution assessment. It's very much of the same pattern. If you look at the solution assessment action, here the central one is taking a long time to look at the quiz result. And then you can see that they're more strongly connected with add and delete concept for the low performer, more strongly connected to the coherent actions for the high performer, and not much difference in terms of the incoherent actions. And so kind of overall, as I was doing this research, I had my own personal ulterior motive as well, that was kind of just to evaluate, can we apply ENA to this type of data and get something interesting? Does it inform us in a way that maybe I wouldn't find the same patterns with a different learning and with a different methodological approach? And I personally found it very helpful to look at the networks, and it kind of opened some questions for me as well. In terms of the things that we found, I already kind of talked about it when we were looking at the network, but this expected cycle of the coherent action, I saw stronger connection with the high performer. Again, that was expected, but I was also expecting to see stronger connection with incoherent action for low performer. And so that was a little bit surprising to me. And then the big open question for me is, what is happening with the adding and deleting concept with the low performer? Because it might just be something as simple as, you know, they don't really understand how to use the user interface. And then instead of deleting the link, they're just deleting the concept and then re-adding the concept. But it could be a more fundamental issue of their conceptualization of the task. And it might be that it's just so confused that they just remove concepts from the map and then try to build from there instead of working with the concepts that are already there. And I'm going to end things here. I'm sure I'm already over the 10 minutes, but thank you very much. And if you're interested, this is the network that includes all the actions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very interesting. So I'll open it up to questions again.
Would you prefer if I stop sharing my screen?
How about you stop sharing your screen just so we can see everybody, and then if we need to pull up a slide, we can do that pretty easily.
Okay.
It's nice, since we're not very many, we can have a nice conversation. Tanya, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, look, thanks for the presentation, very interesting. I'm thinking about what you said for underperforming students, this strong link between adding and deleting concepts. In terms of the previous work that was done on gaming the system, I can't recall whether there was any work on that in relation to Betty's brain, but I'm interested to hear whether you looked at that. Is it that these students really don't know much and they're just trying, you know, guessing, adding, deleting, and then seeing what happens? Have you correlated that behavior with gaming the system?
That's a good question. We haven't looked at gaming the system behavior within Betty's brain. I can try to give you kind of my kind of guess about it. It might be that they're just kind of playing around and trying things. One thing that I would say is that if they're trying to game the system, adding and deleting concept is not the right way to do it, because you're not really going to improve your map score or your performance by just adding or deleting concept much, because once the concept is there, there's really no reason to go back and delete it. What's important, what is going to determine the performance and how good the map is the link between the concept. So deleting links, revising link, right? That could be related to gaming. And I wish Gautam Biswas was here, because he has so much more experience with Betty's brain than I know. He could probably come up with very good example of things he's seen before. But you know, you could see, for example, someone seeing an error from the quiz and then going in the map and then just changing the direction of the link and then going back to test it, right? I could see maybe this as being kind of a gaming behavior. Or like, I know one of the big kind of problems that people have sometimes when they create their map is something called shortcut links, where they have one link that's between two concepts, but really the two concepts are related, but there should be an intermediate concept between them. And so I don't really know if there would be a good way to game the system based on that. Maybe just like if you have a link and somehow you know it's a shortcut, you just like try to break it down without going back to the resources. And so I think with gaming behavior, which I didn't look at it from that perspective, there might be a lot of kind of going forward between building without reading and then testing and building without reading and testing, compared to if you're really trying to figure out what's happening. It's much more difficult to just go back to the map and change something and then go back to test. Usually you would have to go back to the resource, validate what you're seeing, then go to the map and then test.
I'm just wondering, yeah, that's one potential explanation, but I'm just wondering whether you're suffering from teacher's blind spot here, because, you know, in the title we have self-regulation. So I wonder whether you have some kind of measurement of self-regulation, because students who have high self-regulating skills might be gaming the system in a different way from students who have low self-regulating skills. And I could see, I mean, the educational systems we have built here are of different nature, but I could see someone who has very low self-regulating skills doing exactly that, just trying to add something, not thinking, not stopping to evaluate, to self-assess, to reflect, but just adding and deleting concepts. Just a small point, really.
Yeah, but I think that's an interesting point. We didn't look at it from that perspective at all, but you're right that probably if you're not a high self-regulation student, you probably don't have the regulation to actually engage in productive gaming behavior. And then gaming might be a behavior that's related to self-regulation, but maybe not as much self-regulation of the learning process, but more self-regulation of, I don't know, getting through the task. You still need to set up, like, you do need to have a goal when you're gaming, and you need to evaluate if your gaming is successful or in some way. Yeah. So I never thought about it from that perspective, but there's a lot of parallel, yes.
Thank you.
There's actually a great paper that we read in one of my qualitative methods class that actually is talking about this distinction between what is good behavior by a student and what is bad behavior by a student, and it's looking at the way in which what appeared to be bad and disruptive behavior, gaming is the sort of parallel, was actually the student engaging in a very complex calculus of trying to get what she wanted done given the rules of the classroom. And so she was actually incredibly competent at negotiating the rules of the classroom, just not in the way the teacher wanted. So there's some good evidence for.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that's an interesting point, and taking a methodological lens or a QE lens to it. These assumptions about what's incoherent, that was one of your starting points, right? So I was wondering how those classifications came about, and whether if you went back and iterated through and thought about those distinctions a little differently, if you could get an answer to your question potentially, because incoherent kind of have these, some judgments on them, right?
Yeah.
You have expectations that low performers are going to be more engaged in more incoherent actions, but we have all these, different hypotheses now about what that means. Maybe they were not confident. Maybe you have some perfectionist students who just can't, if they put something in, they don't want that there anymore, so they delete it.
Right.
There's lots of explanations.
Yeah, just to go back to kind of your question about how those were coded as coherent or incoherent, and this is based on a definition. I'm not the one who came up with the definition. It's a definition that the Betty's Brain team has been using for a while. And this is based on, they manually coded each resources as being, this resources is related to those concepts. And this question in the quiz is related to those concepts. And so it's based on the concept that are in the resource. And then when they go, let's say in the map, and they add a link between two concepts, then they'll try to see, okay, those two concepts, were they in the resource that the student looked at? And I went over it pretty quickly because I only had 10 minutes for the presentation. So they use a time window of 5 minutes. And so you don't have to use the information right away for it to be still considered coherent, right? You can read multiple resources and then go to the map and make multiple edits in the map, and then they would still be considered coherent. Now, you do make a great point of coherent, incoherent, kind of as a judgment associated to it. I wonder if there would be a better name for it. I didn't really think about it, especially because I wasn't the one who named. But I think that's probably an artifact of when they created the code. They just decided, oh yeah, that's coherent, and they didn't really think about, from the perspective of the student.
Right.
That doesn't mean that's not necessarily a negative thing.
Right.
To do those incoherent action. They might actually be part of the learning process, but
yeah, and I think it might help you answer your question potentially. These questions about why you're seeing somewhat unexpected results. What that was the designer's intention, and then these codes were developed by the designers. But what if you did something a little bit more grounded, more ethnographic in a way, right? Like to kind of look at the data and perhaps collect more data from the student participants themselves. I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. Oh, sorry.
No, go. I was going to follow up on Bill's question, but go.
I think that's a very good point. And I think from, this is, I kind of said selfishly, this is my first time really trying to use ENA with this kind of data personally. So, if I had to do it again, I would probably do things differently. And I think personally, what I liked is that it kind of highlighted things that I didn't understand. And then I would like to follow up to figure out what's happening because it's kind of a more exploratory, at least the way I use it, more exploratory approach. And it links a little bit. We have a grant project. We didn't look at it like it's not directly related to the results that I have here, but where we developed this system that is linked to an handheld phone application where you can program. So it's connected to the Betty's Brain server in real time, and then it's feeding information, and you can program it to say, when this happens, I want to be notified. And the goal is to go and collect more qualitative data by either observing or interviewing the student in real time based on the data that's being fed from Betty's Brain. And so that might be kind of a link where we could use ENA in a way to explore the data, identify things that we don't necessarily understand, and then go back and then kind of program the system to notify us when something that we don't understand is happening. And then we can have in real time researchers in the classroom be notified, okay, this student, this is happening for this student, go figure out why, right? And then we can collect data, and then we can collect interview, and then we can do some more qualitative analysis on the data after that to figure out what's happening.
That's great. That sounds really exciting for your new project. And that kind of addresses this back channel we have in the chat about creating or collecting real-time data. So we can look, if you have a chance, you can take a look at that. And I also want to say, I really appreciate your study. It's I saw that you were using ENA in an exploratory way, and we had a window into that. And I think that's really important for this community to see different researchers and how they're using ENA and other QE tools in an exploratory way. So your method of step-by-step ENA, or whatever you want to call it, right? Adding more groups and making that visible to us as readers and researchers, I thought was a really great approach. And you should call it something. I thought that was really great.
Yeah, and when we started using ENA, we weren't using that approach. We were just kind of generating networks. And then one thing we noticed is that if we didn't have this kind of direction in how we were generating and analyzing the network, it became just so there was just so many things. And there's other types of actions in Betty's Brain that are not included in the analysis here. When you include everything, it becomes so confusing, and there's no way that you can interpret this. And then, so we started removing things that we felt were not as important. But then at some point I started asking myself a question of okay, but what reason am I using to justify removing things? And so using this framework of the 3 categories of open-ended problem-solving approach, which I took from a different paper on Betty's brain, and using that as kind of a way to kind of iteratively generate the networks and look at it from that perspective really helped me. Because before that, I was like, okay, there's something interesting there, but I don't know how to justify it. I don't know how to analyze it. And so using that approach was very useful for me.
Yeah, I thought this was really cool too. And I hope at some point, I haven't read the paper yet, I confess, but I hope that if you haven't in the paper actually talked explicitly about that part of the process and like why you were doing it. Anytime somebody talks about realizing they need to have better justification for their model choices, I'm all for it. And there's a couple other things I want to follow up with you about that I think are really interesting with this. But Yeyu, I think she and I have been back channeling here, and I think she may have at least one question that might be interesting for all of us to and for you to think about. So Nicole, I know we're close to time, but it would be okay if you ask one question at the end here.
Yeah, absolutely. I have her question right here, and then you can ask it yourself. But I also want to give people a chance. The session is technically over, so please feel free to leave and enjoy your evening. But if you want to hang out, also hang out.
Thank you. Thanks, David and Go and Luke for the presentation. It's always really fascinating to look at the grammar of the log data. And I have a question, or I have some thoughts around how you put many codes or constructs into the ENA network. And you just talk about you were not sure which one to remove or justify the reason to remove. I was thinking this as a question to how to make the model to be more parsimonious. Then you could maybe justify the reduced model or interpret based on the reduced model. So I have been working on some a kind of like a principle guided way to generate a more parsimonious ENA model that takes several principles or the criteria. I'm happy to share with you maybe offline that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to look at it. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like you'd want to do some combination of exploring the space to figure out what things might be worth including, and then even in any of your later graphs, there were tons of these really thin lines that you could perhaps make a more parsimonious model if you had a principled way of saying, well, we included this category, but these two parts of it maybe not so much, or something like that.
Yeah, and this is maybe more an open question to the ENA team, but one of the things, I think I talk a little bit about it in the paper, but one of the things is because we were looking at kind of, those different categories individually and then the interactions between categories, one thing that happened is that when we generated the networks that included two categories, we would get all the links, including the links between actions from the same category, right? Which means that, we needed to kind of focus our attention to just the ones between the categories. And so we add, let's say, didn't put the example in the talk, but I remember that we had at least one model where ENA was saying there is a statistically significant difference here. But when we looked at it, what was driving the statistically significant difference was the differences within the category rather than the differences between the categories. And this might be just because I'm using ENA in a way that it's not supposed to be used. But that's kind of one of the things that came up, is that if we were able to remove those links, at least visually from the graph, and there might be a way to do it, I just don't know it, then it would make the graph much more easier to look at and to digest visually.
That's doable.
I know that in the review, some people said you can do this if you use the R version of ENA, but I didn't use the R version of ENA. So yeah.
Well, I think but you're being wise in terms of how you're thinking about the interpretation. I just wanted to echo what Goal said too. I really liked how you talked about the iterativity and exploring, and especially how you talked about what you expected to see and what you didn't expect. And how, because that, as Goals pointed out, it could lead you to change your coding and stuff. But I think that discussion is a really important one, especially for other people that are learning to use these methods. And to me, it's also some of the most interesting things. Is like if you've been looking at it and you understand this stuff, but then something surprises you. That often happens when people are using ENA, and like you look and you're like, oh no, the way I set this model up makes sense, but then there's still some like artifact of connections that you hadn't seen before or need further investigation. I think that's like an approach that's worth you know, foregrounding. So nice work. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you to Karin. Thank you to Luke for presenting. And this was a really great discussion. I really enjoyed this group. Thank you. Oh, David, are you raising your hand because you have another question? Oh, you wanted to applause. Okay. Yes. So let's give a round of applause to our participants. Thank you so much. And, you know, of course, you can follow up with Karin or Luke if you want to discuss further. So I've been asking everyone to do this, but can you unmute and say goodbye so we can actually hear it? It's not a silent goodbye.
Goodbye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Goodbye.
Hi, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good evening.
Hi, thanks.
Thank you for joining us.